Good afternoon, everybody, and good morning or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for joining our webinar this afternoon. We're the Migration Policy Centre at the European University Institute in Florence, in Italy. This afternoon, we've got, or this afternoon for us, we've got a great webinar which is on the theme of climate mobilities, thinking about migration, mobilities, immobilities, and climate change. And we've got 4 speakers who are all going to be addressing the relationship between migration and climate. And I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First of all, we have Ingrid Boas, who is actually a visiting fellow with us here at the Migration Policy Centre, and is also an associate professor at the Environmental Policy Group at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. We will then hear from Karel Fabotko, who is a research scientist with the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation in Australia, and we're very grateful with the time differences that Karel has been able to join us today. We'll then hear from Etham Chantohan, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Spatial Planning and Environment in the Faculty of Spatial Sciences at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. And the 4th presentation will be from Mimi Scheller, who is professor of sociology and head of the Department of Sociology, as well as the director of the Centre for Mobilities Research and Policy at Drexel University. And again, with the time differences, we're really grateful that Mimi's been able to join us today. So just in terms of the housekeeping for this event, each speaker will have around 10 or 11 minutes from each speaker. And if you want to ask questions, to do is put them into the chat section on our YouTube channel, so we can monitor that. So if you have questions, then please use the chat function in YouTube. So we will have plenty of time for comments, questions, and to discussion. And we really very much appreciate your input to the session. I'm so sure the speakers will be very happy to engage with the audience, even in this constrained way that we have to do things nowadays via the internet. So you're very welcome. And what I'd like to do now is immediately hand over to Ingrid Boas. So over to you, Ingrid.
Okay, somehow my presentation disappeared after we open it. Sorry. Sorry, I don't see my presentation coming up anymore. Let me leave it again. Ah, here. Okay, sorry. Okay, thank you all. And I'm happy that I got the chance to organize and set up this webinar, which will be on climate mobilities. So in this short presentation, I will kick off in introducing our new research agenda on climate mobilities. So in essence, it seeks to rethink the debate on the relation between climate change and migration, which is often talked about in quite alarmist terms. So we tend to think of millions of people on the run for their lives, fleeing extreme storms, drought, sea level rise. And also often assumptions are made that this movement again spirals into chaos, conflict, possibly even war. So when we think about climate change induced migration, we tend to think about something apocalyptic. And this quite alarming discourse is still guiding much policy, media, but also scientific narratives on the subject. So in a recent collective contribution we made on migration myths in Nature Climate Change, we have warned against it, against some of the problematic aspects of this narrative for leading to a securitization of the subject. So indeed, thinking about climate migration as something threatening, chaotic, it leads to efforts to primarily reduce mobility, whilst mobility can also be a central part of social life, and further fuels the development of even stricter migration regimes. But more importantly, our presentations today will show, which will also form the basis of a special issue that we are writing on this with the Journal of Ethnic and Migration Studies, that such a narrative doesn't really fit with the empirical realities that we see, in which we see various types of movement in the context of environmental and climatic changes that are diverse, fragmented, and uneven. So therefore, we have introduced this new concept of climate mobilities and an associated research agenda to capture the multiple forms, directions, and multiplicities of human movements in the context of climate change, as well as their transformative character, also taking into account connections between mobilities and immobilities playing out on different scales, as for instance, the interrelations also between elite mobilities and those displaced by climate change, as Mimi Scheller will, for instance, go into in her presentation on the end. In my own presentation now, I will showcase this fragmented and uneven nature of climate mobilities and how they take place on diverse spatial and temporal scales, focusing on Bangladesh. And in doing so, also showing how the relationship between climate change and human mobility is often playing out in quite different ways than what we expect. So turning now further to Bangladesh. So I'm focusing on where I did my fieldwork, which was in the central south of Bangladesh, right in the center of its dynamic river delta. So if zooming in, you see that this is an area that is heavily affected by river erosion and land changes taking place in the delta. So here, the blue areas are lost pieces of land to water over the last 30 years, and the green are newly emerging pieces of land, so which happening naturally in the delta area. So a lot of changes going on already in the delta, but it's also now hit a lot by cyclones, which are becoming also increasingly severe in the context of climate changes. So what I want to talk about is how people respond when there is a cyclone in this area. So what you see here are flows of movement of people during Cyclone Moasen, which hit this area in May 2013, analyzed through mobile tower data, called anonymized call detail records, not by me, but by other researchers, Lou Redhall and others. This data includes, for each call, the position of the mobile phone tower closest to the caller, and can thereby detect movement of people when their phone switches between mobile towers. So red flows show more movement than normal, and blue flows represent less movement than normal. So what you see here is a sudden large-scale movement of people during the storm and the hours around it. So the authors who produced this work have hypothesized that these flows are representing displacement during that cyclone. So in other words, most people were probably temporarily displaced, seeking shelter in safer areas. The problem, however, with such big data sets is that you cannot be sure what types of movements these flows actually represent until you go there and trace what happened on the ground. So we can think that this proves human displacement during storms, but we're not sure. Just like with these big apocalyptic narratives that we just talked about on climate change, induced migration, and climate refugees, we don't really know what's really going on until we go to the areas that we're talking about. So in collaboration with David Redhall from Oregon State University, who co-produced this data, I went to one of these areas to find out what actually happened. Was there indeed mass displacement from homes? So to be honest, I went there also with the idea that probably their hypothesis was right, and probably it had something to do with evacuation and forced displacement. So I also, by seeing this image, thought of, okay, this is probably how it looks like, and probably taking place in quite chaotic ways in that sense. But then when I was, so I was focusing on this area, which is in the south of Chorvestion, which is a part of the island called Bola. So, but when I was there and asking around, it turned out that most people didn't go to the shelter in that area during that storm. Instead, they often stayed home to save their belongings, or stayed on high roads or on the embankments in front of their houses, which was possible as the water had not breached the embankment. So they only went to shelter if it was really located very close by. But still, yeah, so in a way, you saw a large-scale movement of people in this image, but it was not displacement or evacuation as was sort of hypothesized. So what was it then? What was actually going on? So it turned out to be hundreds of fishermen heading towards coastal areas to secure their trawlers, their fishing ships. Some of these are huge, and they invested large amounts of money in it, and so their key livelihoods are organized around that. So during cyclones, also this one, it's sort of a common strategy, a livelihood strategy, that they move towards the harbor areas and tie them up, and everybody's calling each other to come and help out. Several also reported to, for instance, in one of these big ships, sometimes 20 people work, and that they would all stay there during this the cyclone to ensure that it wouldn't drift off into the sea. So basically, this area turned out, in that sense, not to be highly vulnerable, because the water didn't cross the embankment, so people were able to move around, able to make a choice to go and save their boats and save their trawlers. But in the other area, where you now see a white square on the screen, there was actually hardly to little movement according to this analysis. And that is actually where most of the vulnerability actually was. But that had not given much attention into this big data analysis, which was focused on, on detecting movements during the storm, and not focused on detecting perhaps cases of immobility, or at least reduced mobility. So in this area, there was actually a very weak embankment because of all the erosion processes that were already taking place. There was a huge hole here, for instance, that you see in this picture. So already with, just some strong rains, it's really, the water rises from the Magna River, and it flows into the market area behind this. So people reported that they did went to cyclone shelters, which are in this area. So they're in the range also of a mobile phone tower. And they reported also to even climb trees or stay on rooftops in order to save their lives. At least it was very dangerous to go to the harbor area and to go and save their boats. It was no longer an option in this area. So no to little movement in this image could actually indicate greater vulnerability than where you see a lot of movement. At least it shows us that assumptions we often have are not necessarily correct when you're zooming in when thinking about the relationships between environmental change, climate change, and mobilities. Furthermore, this area where you saw restricted movements in the context of the cyclone was in the long term more prone to structural mobilities of people having to move away because people were losing their homes because of these erosion processes. In that area, about 5 kilometers of land have been taken by the river over the last 20 years. So people do lose their homes, but not all at once, but it goes very gradually. So this year, a certain group of people have lost their homes, another year, another group of people. So it goes gradually, and it's not so visible. So not a lot of help or support is coming because it doesn't make the news. It's sort of, but goes bit by bit. but still people are quite heavily affected by it. So those with the least resources or social networks, they actually just move up a little bit, just rebuilding their house on the latest embankment, which is often government land. Some who have somewhat more resources can maybe buy a plot or get a house a bit more inland on the same area, because often people feel quite attached to the areas, so don't necessarily want to move very far away. There are also several who have bought land on these newly emerging areas in the Delta, which are called chores. But this is also often quite political and related to who you vote for, if you can go and get a place here. And then there are many also, because this area is quite well connected to Dhaka with launches, which are big boats that people can go on, that connect this area on a daily basis, where they go for work, sometimes also move with their whole families, but quite often just some members of them, usually male members, go there to work and remain strongly connected with those at home. I also met many people there who actually wanted to return back home because after almost 20 years of waiting, there was news that the embankment was finally being reconstructed and that the area would be better protected. So I also met many people who were away in Dhaka, but trying to reconnect with those at home to try and set up businesses back at home in order to move back, which also shows which goes against our idea, oh, everybody wants to move out and head to a safer area. People feel very closely attached to these, to their homes in Bangladesh, and also want to stay if that's possible. So I think to conclude my story, I hope this shows, at least gives a first flavor of how climate mobilities are often much more complex and dynamic than we think, and do not neatly mirror the apocalyptic stories on mass climate migration that we read about in the newspapers. So climate mobilities are plural, uneven, and are even quite local, as opposed to being a unidirectional mass population movement heading our way. And the next presenters that will follow will go into some of these themes more deeply, including the role of place attachment, but also uneven mobilities playing out on different scales. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Ingrid. So I will hand straight over to Carol Farbotko, and because I think her talk picks up very nicely from the points you've just made. So over to you, Carol. Can you unmute yourself, Carol?
Yes. Hello. Sorry, just a bit of trouble sharing my screen there too. Okay. Hello, everyone. Really nice to be here. So I'm going to be talking today from another of the typically imagined to be apocalyptic sites of climate migration, which is Tuvalu, which I have been working for many years. Tuvalu is one of the very small island atoll states in the Pacific. So climate change displacement risk in these low-lying islands is often described as an existential threat. But I view it as much a political discourse as a scientific prediction. And so that opens up looking at alternatives to this dominant imaginary. And I think these are an important topic of study for those who are interested in climate mobilities, but also multiple knowledges more generally and the agency of the vulnerable. So I think in anticipated displacement in these sites of risk that are often identified in scientific kind of discourses, anticipated displacement is often not seen as a valid alternative. There's not seen as any sort of valid alternatives, but there are contestations to this discourse. And I think we need to tune into these a little bit more carefully. So how are populations at risk of displacement actually actively contesting this discourse? And to do this, we need to consider them primarily as political subjects, not just people potentially on the move and in need of protection. So I think this opens up new ways of understanding climate mobilities. So Tuvalu is very small. I'll be focusing today on the capital atoll of Funafuti. There's on Whangawhalla here, there's a, this is where the main city is, but I'm also going to be talking about a rural village on a separate little island called Funawhala. So a first observation I want to make is that we don't yet have a full conceptual language with which to adequately describe and account for alternatives to the dominant displacement imaginary. So I'd like to just offer some really preliminary ideas about how this might be started to look at. So voluntary immobility is a term that might be to some extent useful, and it is a term that I have used in my previous research because it goes some part way to recognising agency and intention among populations who have been deemed to be at risk. However, it does little to capture the particular context-specific ways in which alternatives to displacement are being tabled, advocated for, and practiced within those populations. So what does the political practice of anti-displacement look like? Those scholars who are Indigenous people of the atolls in the Pacific, such as Kiribati, Tuvalu and Marshalls, offer much more in the way of conceptual innovation to explore this space. So Katerina Tiaiwa, who is an academic at the Australian National University, calls for a recognition in emerging legal and policy frameworks of Indigenous concepts of territory, such as in her own Banaban culture, which is a part of Kiribati, in which the erasure of both place and identity are ontologically impossible. Another scholar or Indigenous knowledge holder and climate change activist, Taukia Kitara, who is a close collaborator in my own work, argues in a similar vein that the Westphalian notion of land-based sovereignty is ripe for decolonisation. He sees the inevitable displacement narrative to be too easily manipulated by external parties. Some of these, he says, are already seeking to undermine the political agency of atoll populations through what he calls neoliberal bargaining processes. So these include proposals to solve the displacement problem, in quotes, by trading foreign citizenship to populations at risk in return for legal rights to their sovereign space. And exactly the same criticism has been articulated by the Tuvalu Prime Minister at the time, Enele Pawanga. So we see activists, scholars and political leaders alike seeking to challenge displacement narratives with the tools of decolonisation, Indigenous rights and Indigenous knowledges. So it seems to me to be quite clear that anti-displacement has a politics, and it is a topic that needs to be much more extensively explored as a practice. So in the Tuvaluan context, internal population mobility from the urban areas towards rural coastal villages is occurring. Remote rural communities with limited cash economy and significant coastal impacts such as erosion and increased salinity might be expected to be experiencing outmigration in the usual kind of approach to what climate mobility looks like. But that is not what is observable in Funawhala, which is the rural village outside the capital that I indicated in the map. So mainstream adaptation thinking would consider this potentially problematic. But in early 2019, when I was last there, migration of families into the village from the capital was increasing. All of them had Indigenous claims on the land. None of the households wished to move away from the village, despite knowledge of the long-term threat of uninhabitability. The residents of Funafala wanted to improve their cultural and physical well-being, feeling a sense of nourishment in the life that they were seeking closer to the land. Local seawalls were being built out of wood. Coastal erosion was being buffered using trash, and mangroves were being planted. But the point here is not so much to determine the material success of these adaptation activities, but to consider a possible symbolic politics that they embody, particularly when combined with interview data with the villagers that suggest their long-term commitment is to that village, that they are acutely aware of the displacement narrative, but they are actively working to make Funafala, a vibrant Indigenous place. So migrating away, a lot of them are migrating from the capital to this rural village. And this migration may, I suggest, be a way for people to actively work on maintaining their valued political subjectivity as Indigenous people of Funafuti, reconnecting to their ancestors, their land and their culture amidst the uncertainty of displacement risk. So this pattern was quite small scale in 2019. It only involved about 12 households, but it expanded significantly with the onset of the pandemic. And during the pandemic, some 25% of the capital's population actually moved to the relative safety of all of Tuvalu's rural islands. And this movement was part of what to date has been a successful mission to keep COVID-19 out of Tuvalu altogether. And this is the type of mobility that I suggest might be called re-emplacement, which I preliminarily define as processes in which ideas, people, or matter become mobile in order to counter anticipated displacement, or perhaps other external threats such as pandemics, and reclaim, repossess, and revitalise space that is already theirs. So a different kind of re-emplacement is observable in Tuvalu's land reclamation projects, where dredged lagoon sand is being moved from under the lagoon to a new stretch of land, sand physically being re-emplaced to fortify island territory and extend its habitability. So this is what we can see happening on the capital. This was a big project that extended the beach, and a new development was built on this patch of sand about 3 years ago. So through a decolonial reading of the narratives surrounding these types of rural migrations and coastal adaptation projects, I think it's possible to argue that there is a common politics uniting these mobilities of people and place that is similar, as mechanisms for people named at risk of displacement to reclaim, repossess, and revitalise the place and space that is already theirs. Arguably, these signify the assertion of territorial rights and associated political rights of self-determination and Indigenous sovereignty against those who suggest that displacement is inevitable. And they may even have geopolitical significance one day, signalling that atoll populations are not accepting of this brewing attempt to be pawns in a geopolitical battle for control over their sovereign space, particularly their exclusive economic zones. So atolls themselves are dynamic islands, and social life on islands is already embedded in this dynamism, but placemaking practices need to be studied more intensively to consider how the anti-displacement politics is inscribed in everyday life, in texts, and in the dynamic landscape itself. Little is known, for example, about how the physical adaptation measures of the national government, such as this project here, which is already showing signs of deterioration and damage, are being used, maintained, and perhaps contested within various subgroups of the population. So I'm not claiming that this is a holistic resistance to the displacement narrative. More work needs to be done. So in conclusion, I think there is a need for a new conceptual language to counter the discursive momentum that seems to favour the inevitability of displacement. Concepts like re-emplacement can help articulate how a rejection of the displacement category is far from a practice of passive immobility, but rather an active decolonial remaking of what home and place is. Thank you.
Have you finished, Carol? Can you hear me?
Yes, I finished.
Yes.
All right, thank you very much, Carol. Sorry, I got an unstable connection on my end. So I'd like now to hand from the University of Groningen. So,
thank you, Andrew. I'll try to share my screen. Share. I hope you can see it now. Okay. Well, first of all, let me express my heartfelt thanks to Ingrid and the whole team at the EUI for putting this great event together. It's an incredible honor for me to be with some of the leading scholars in the field, such as Ingrid, Carol, and Mimi, and talk about climate mobilities. But maybe before I start, I would like to give a quick disclaimer. Unlike many people here, both in the panel today and also those who are watching us, I'm not really coming from the field of migration or mobility studies. As an environmental engineer turned political ecologist, my interest in climate mobilities actually didn't came from migration studies per se, but it actually arose from my interest and research into climate change adaptation and how and why it fails to deliver its promise, and why adaptation fails to reduce and or remove the vulnerabilities of the most marginalized communities, and among those a key group being the migrant seasonal agricultural workers. So today I'll try to refer to them as seasonal workers for the sake of simplicity. So my contribution today will focus less on how climate change produces and reproduces novel forms of mobilities, but rather will focus more on how existing patterns of human mobility are affected, influenced, and impacted by climate change, and to what extent adaptation interventions can help, and when they do, why do they fail? So part of this work that I'm going to talk briefly about today is coming from my contribution to a forthcoming edited volume titled Climate Change in the Global Workplace, Labor Adaptation and Resistance, edited by Nitya Natarayan and Laurie Parsons. So market-oriented agriculture, particularly labor-intensive forms of it, are heavily dependent on mobile and seasonal labor. Overexploitation of natural resources, socioeconomic upheaval, and rapid environmental change increasingly mark the limits of such labor-intensive production patterns around the world. One of these places being the Mediterranean basin, a region severely threatened by the impacts of climate change, something you can also find the details about this in the recent report, Mediterranean Assessment Report 1, which is just out yesterday. So increasingly uncertain climatic patterns insecure labor conditions, mass displacement due to proxy wars, and ever-shifting typologies of human mobility all contribute to the persistence of what Corrado and others call as cheap food, cheap labor, and high profits logic. Adaptation to climate change has emerged at this juncture as a timely topic with significant potential for instigating transformative change, or in the worst case scenario, emboldening the status quo. So while changing temporalities and deteriorating environmental conditions reveal complex dynamics in the Mediterranean agro-migration system, the protagonists of this activity, seasonal workers, migrant seasonal agricultural workers, are often sidelined in the studies in different fields such as political ecology, critical human geography, climate change adaptation studies writ large. So when Carolyn Popp refers to seasonal migrants as undercounted, undervalued, and underprotected, she's really onto something extremely important here. Seasonal workers, or farm workers in the US jargon, feed the world through their labor, bringing fruits, vegetables, and other crops to millions of homes. Their work is critical, yet they and their work have not been properly valued and acknowledged. So these seasonal workers earn poverty wages, work under substandard conditions, face a myriad of health and other issues due to their living and working conditions. So it's important to think the mobilities of the seasonal and temporary workers as these are affected, negotiated, and managed somewhat by the responses to larger looming crises, such as climate change or COVID-19, as we have most recently seen. The spatialities, materialities, and temporalities of mobile agricultural labor is bound to radically change as the most severe impacts of climate change kick in. And on this point, I would say that I agree with most critical scholars, for instance, like those of Mike Davis, when he says that COVID-19 is only the trailer of what comes next with the climate crisis. Or thinking together with Arundhati Roy, acclaimed Indian author and activist, who suggests that pandemic is a portal to another world, showing us a sneak peek of what might happen, either an emboldening of status quo or a radical transformative change. For instance, it's telling that the Council of the European Union, the Union's highest decision-making body, designated seasonal workers in agriculture as travelers with an essential function or need on par with healthcare professionals, border workers, transport staff, and diplomats, among other exceptional categories. In the circular it has issued on 30th of June this year, which was a part of the EU's joint COVID response. And ILO's report back in March this year also stressed that migrant seasonal workers are in particular more defenseless against the effects of COVID-19. And actually, when the second version of this report came in, it suggested that workers in agricultural sector constitute the highest risk group. The world map you see here is produced by Development Workshop, which is a research and advocacy cooperative based in Turkey doing cutting-edge work on seasonal workers. And the map here depicts a snapshot, only a snapshot of some of the most visible forms of agricultural labor mobility around the world today, obviously with some loopholes in data. So we don't really see the whole picture, but we can actually have a snapshot of what is going on. So what this suggests is that actually even the very fact that data being missing for the most of the global south shows how undercounted, undervalued, and underprotected are the seasonal workers. Mimi's fascinating work on mobility justice from Verso also raises the issue of unequal access, a topic that has long been at the heart of climate and environmental justice debates, which is at the heart of climate mobilities today, in my opinion. So I believe it's impossible to think about climate mobilities today without simultaneously thinking and acting on the gendered, racialized, ethnicized divisions of agricultural labor, fly-in and fly-out workforces, as Mimi calls it, and also buffering the loss of profits through bodily harm and overexploitation of disposable mobile labor. So again, and as Mimi underlines, and here I quote her, power and inequality inform the governance and control of movement, shaping the patterns of uneven mobility and immobility in the circulation of people, end of quote. And this is an issue that we have to really address and take into the heart of the debates on climate mobilities. Because, for instance, in the US, the exclusion of farm workers, seasonal workers in agriculture from labor protections is a shameful racist legacy of the compromise made by Roosevelt in 1938 to get Southern segregationists to support his New Deal. And I think it makes sense that we speak about this at the eve of a Green New Deal today, who were at time the workers being primarily Black workers. Well, decades later, the only thing that has changed is the demography of these seasonal workers. They are primarily Hispanic today, but all in all, it's still the marginalized people of color who are also at the front lines of the climate crises and pandemics, and thus should be the ones most prioritized in the debates on climate mobilities. And with this, I don't mean that we shouldn't care about the migration, transnational migration per se. Quite the contrary, I would argue that actually we should care far more than security-oriented approaches, kind of following up on what Ingrid mentioned at the beginning, and also take a care-focused, justice-focused approach to human mobility. And this begins with overcoming the collective obsession with nation-state borders, desirable and undesirable forms of human mobility, and basically acting on climate crisis today, not tomorrow. Although probably not enough, Italian response and also Portuguese response to legalize undocumented workers at the height of the COVID-19 crisis is a case in this point. So things are possible. So in order to understand how migrant agricultural labor and climate change interact under the global capitalist agriculture, it's imperative to also dig deeper into the processes of labor, environment, and seasonal temporal migration. And I would say that this calls for attention to migrants' agency, as well as the structural conundrums in which they find themselves. For instance, Ben Rogali argues that the agency of the unorganized temporary migrant workers have been relatively neglected in labor geography, particularly when it comes to how their agency is or is not manifested in spaces of production. Tim Mitchell similarly cautions us that we shouldn't overestimate the degree to which workers can make their own spatial fixes, given the impediments to their shaping of the geographies of capitalism due to systemic discrimination, brutal tactics of capital, and the complex politics of state-led construction and management of their precarity. So at this point, I would argue that actually socio-ecological cost shifting acts as an enabling condition for capital accumulation and immiseration of seasonal workers that results from their double exposure to crushing demands of the global agri-food system and deteriorating work conditions, also due to climate change. Cost-shifting practices make power asymmetries and distributional issues explicit, particularly when they emerge under climatic contingencies. Yet, these are often viewed as cost-shifting successes of landowners, to borrow the term from Joan Martinez Alier, and also of market actors and state authorities. So my previous work have shown that actually in the case of Turkey, the state's law enforcement and regulatory agencies foster and protect the accumulation of capital by ensuring a circulation of agricultural labor and thus remaking the spaces of agricultural work and maintenance of precarious labor flows and agri-food systems, therefore, must be at the heart of our debate on climate mobilities. So I think it's important to think that spatiality and temporalities of mobile labor is being disrupted and will further be disrupted by the accelerating impacts of climate change. A notable example of this was, for instance, the failure of apricot harvest in the eastern Turkish province of Malatya a couple of years back, when a sudden hailstorm, which is being extremely more frequent in the region, actually crushed over the region, which provides more than 80% of the global dried apricots, causing thousands of migrant seasonal workers to lose wages or change their migration trajectory overnight. And so the changing spatial and temporal characteristics of fruit and vegetable production in places like Malatya are in direct relation with the environmental conditions, energy and labor costs, as well as financial investments. So to sum up, if adaptation interventions fail to address the underlying exploitation, exclusion, and active abandonment of seasonal workers, they have no chance of advancing towards transformation or transformative adaptation, I would argue. Time is running out for incremental approaches to prove effective, and there is an inescapable need for a radical transformative change that combines sustainability and justice, particularly on this topic of climate mobilities. And we need to understand transformation as something more radical than mere change or even transition to a new world where climate effects happen and we try to adjust to those. So this calls for a systemic, multidimensional, intersectional approach with a resistance and justice-centered perspective. And this requires a rethinking of political, social, economic goals to ensure a just approach to climate mobilities. And I think this is valid for seasonal workers bearing the biggest brunts of climate crisis, as well as the migrants and refugees who are left out in the cold today, who are often also forced to join the ranks of the disposable army of mobile labor. Thank you.
Thank you, FM Chan. And there, I think just as a quick, before we pass over to Mimi, just a quick note to everybody who's joined us on YouTube. If you do want to pose questions, and we do very much welcome questions, comments, please do so in the chat function on YouTube. Just to respond to some of the people who've been asking whether the presentations will be shared, well, this recording will be available on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to watch it again and see the presentations again if you want to do that. So without taking any more time, I'm delighted now to offer the floor to Mimi Scherler.
Okay, great, thank you. Are you seeing my shared screen now?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, let me go full scale there. So wonderful to hear all of these talks, and I think the work that Ingrid and Carol and FM Chan have presented are great reminders of the complexity of what we're calling climate mobilities, and really thinking through how climate mobilities connect to various kinds of questions of justice, questions of what our ethical response going forward should be. And really it's been kind of dominated in recent times by this idea of climate refugees and this fear that our borders are being flooded by I mean, those in the global north, in the US, the EU, Australia, who have been pushing away refugees. And the fear of climate refugees is kind of building on that sort of wall building and expulsion response. And so it's really important for us to be able to develop alternative analyses, ways of talking about it, ways of thinking about it. And I think this idea of climate mobilities is an important way to do that. So I myself am going to be drawing on my work on mobility justice. And in my book, Mobility Justice, I try to develop what I call a kind of more robust or comprehensive theory of mobility justice in order to address the combined crises around climate change, unsustainable urban mobilities and transport systems, and unsustainable border systems, including the current crackdown on transnational migration. And the concept of mobility justice, I want to give a quote about it that I like from Baldwin, Froelich, and Roth, whose work is on what they call Anthropocene mobilities, published in the journal Mobilities. And they say the concept is powerful precisely because it positions capitalism along with its fossil-fueled infrastructures of air travel, automobility, suburbanization, and consumerism at the very center of the concern about climate change and displacement. And I want to pick up on that idea to think through how mobilities of the sort of global north and the mobilities that we take for granted in our everyday worlds, and which we're very aware of now because of the COVID-19 shutdown of mobilities. It's really brought to the forefront how dependent we are on this constant flow of movement and how difficult it is for our economies and our societies to function without that constant mobility, how that is linked to climate change and displacement. And let's see. So in this work on Anthropocene mobilities, that Baldwin, Froelich, and Roth talk about how we can use the concepts of mobility justice and what you here today are calling climate mobilities to recharacterize those displaced by climate change, not as climate refugees, but as displacees of a globalized network of intersecting mobility regimes fueled by fossil fuel extraction. And I think that's another kind of scale of what everyone here is describing as these kind of more complex ways of thinking about the interconnections between different kinds of displacements and placements and how those work together. And to do that, I want to talk a little bit about climate debt. That is that those of us in the industrialized regions of the global north, especially the wealthiest 10%, consume more energy and more fuel than most people in the world. And I refer to that group, in which I include myself, as the kinetic elite, those with high motility, that is high potential for movement, who generally have high energy lifestyles, are especially responsible for carbon emissions, and that's causing climate change and displacement around the world. So by understanding climate displacement as being driven by our fossil fueled way of life, for those of us who live in the global north or the industrialized countries, we can begin on a better footing to discuss the reception of climate migrants or the contribution we can make to helping people stay in place. And you may have seen this kind of data set, which shows cumulative carbon dioxide emissions from 1751 to 2017, who's contributed the most. And you see the USA is 25% of global cumulative emissions, the EU 22%, China has been climbing, but that's a very, it's an interesting take on it, but it's very abstract in a way, and I don't think people necessarily connect this to their own individual activities, but it's an important way to measure our climate debt and therefore our climate responsibility. And I use that to kind of think through, in the book, I talk about principles of mobility justice, and they begin from the basic existing, UN conventions on the rights to freedom of movement and enjoying a right to exit and re-enter territory from which you originate, and a right to refuge for those fleeing violence, persecution, and loss of domicile by war. But then add to that the idea that people displaced by climate change shall have a right to resettlement in other countries, especially in those countries that contributed the most to climate change. And it's a way of thinking about what's our responsibility, what's our obligation in international law from a state-based perspective, but also in terms of thinking through who will pay for that. And there's arguments around climate loss and damages and possibility of suing fossil fuel companies and having them pay a climate damages tax or payment that would go into a fund that would help countries like Tuvalu to build up protections, or like Bangladesh, to help with resettlement processes or just temporary movement processes. So in that sense, I think the question of climate debt is a way to think about, okay, when we see images in the Western media, they're often images like this of people in faraway places who have been displaced by droughts, by landslides, by cyclones. This very week, we have the 30th named hurricane or tropical storm in the Atlantic and Caribbean region, and Hurricane Eta and followed by Hurricane Iota have just been hitting Honduras and other parts of Central America. And I think it's important to remember, as Carol emphasized, the political colonial processes behind this, and that like the displacement of people from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, which has led to this Trump administration's, call for building the border walls, has been produced over time, including the North American Free Trade Agreement, which undermined rural agricultural economies in Central America and displaced people from their land. And then US government and geopolitical policies, right, that armed paramilitaries and trained them and destabilized governments in Central America. And again, displaced rural people, strengthened narco economies and drug cartels, brought violent gangs into the cities and small towns across Central America. And so the coming of sort of hurricanes on top of that is building upon this already vulnerability that's produced by imperial and geopolitical and colonial relations. So it's important to sort of look at the ways in which Thomas Nail in his book, Theory of the Border, talks about thinking about that as the way these processes of kinopolitics have driven displacements, and they're not just about climate change. And another way to think about that is Saskia Sassen's idea of expansion by expulsion, and how land grabs for mining, for agriculture, for claiming water resources are what are driving these people to be in vulnerable places in the first place, and to not have the traditional means of adjusting to changing climate patterns, which might involve various kinds of temporary movement, but also safety and protection amongst communities. So racially uneven vulnerability and death. We've entered a new era, you could say, especially after COVID-19, of heavily controlled movement governed by racialized security regimes, kind of bio-governance with all of this, checking of people's temperatures, and soon, who knows, we might need, to have vaccinations and show that people have been vaccinated before they can cross borders, and this extreme kinopolitics of nationalism, bordering, and expulsion that we've seen rising in the global north. And as the anthropologist Yarimar Bonilla writes, vulnerability is not simply a product of natural conditions. It's a political state and a colonial condition. And we see that vulnerability to COVID-19 is also a political state and a colonial condition because it's so unevenly distributed. In the US, it's Black, Brown, and Indigenous people who have been much more heavily hit by it. And that's linked to this deeper moral case for climate reparations based on the long-term effects of these systems of coloniality, imperialism, and racial capitalism. So that leads me to argue that the growth we've seen in this system of deadly corridors, where people are funneled into, rickety boats in the Mediterranean or into the Sonoran Desert, where they're dying by the thousands over the last 5 to 10 years. Detention camps, we've seen, the US has pushed people, refugees, aside, legitimate claimants are being pushed back into camps on the Mexican side of the border to wait. And spaces of confinement at our borders is illegal, it's ineffective, and it's immoral. And it needs to be subjected to critical analysis and alternative frameworks before it becomes the de facto response to all future migrations. And that's why it's so important that we propose alternative ways to think about this. So to conclude, I want to just argue that a holistic theory of mobility justice can help us perceive the connections across many different climate mobilities, including our own fossil fuel mobilities, our own extractive economy mobilities, the kinds of food systems that Etham-chan was talking about, how these are all connected, tourism mobilities. We need a robust political language defending the right of people to migrate in anticipation of climate change, as Wainwright and Mann have argued in Climate Leviathan. But we also must defend the right to dwell, to remain, right, to restore places, to share commons, and to reparative justice, which is why the payment of climate debt and climate reparations is so important. If we in the global north build kind of fortress cities with heavy borders around our safe world, we will always be tempted to continue to externalize environmental harms, expel the unwanted, expendable people to the sacrifice zones outside our borders, which will just continue to drive climate instability, climate change, climate disruption, and displacement. So we should instead focus on the question of responsibility and reparations in a moral, legal, and financial framework under international law. So I'll just conclude by saying we need to move beyond treating these different kinds of justice as separate, right? So we have work on transport justice, spatial justice, migrant justice, environmental justice, climate justice. For me, these are all interconnected struggles over the politics of mobility, or kinopolitics, and they each directly impinge on the others. Mobility justice means that ecological urbanism or green cities or sustainability cannot come at the expense of the marginalized poor, the migrant, or the excluded minority. Without mobility justice, we will never achieve planetary sustainability. And a holistic theory of mobility justice and a program of framing the issues of climate mobilities, Anthropocene mobilities in this way can help us perceive the connections across these many different scales of mobility, from the racialized body to the detention of migrants to the ease of travel for global elites. And international struggles for mobility justice also must address these legacies of colonialism and present forms of coloniality to confront questions of access, control, and ownership of land, of resources, of safe places of life. Climate migration, finally, is also about the migration of plants, animals, weather systems, agriculture, and the disruption of our existing kind of geostabilities that we've had over a period of time. We're all already climate migrants because our planet is moving and alive, and our future will entail multiple uprootings and regroundings beyond human control, but not bereft of moral obligations to one another and to the world. Thank you. I will end there with a little plug for my new book, Island Futures, Caribbean Survival in the Anthropocene. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the speakers. I think we've had 4 really rich presentations, so much insight and expertise and great ideas have been shared. So what we would do now is open it up to our audience for questions and comments. So we do have some, and I will try and direct them to, if they are directed at an individual, I will do that. Some of them I think are more general. We have a question which is actually directly for Ingrid from Sarah E. Obviously this is all YouTube, so sometimes you don't know people's full names, but Sarah E, who thanks you for your presentations and also asks if you could comment on relocations undertaken by the Bangladeshi government. I'll ask her, I'll put a few questions because we had quite a few come in. So that was from Sarah E. Leonora Torres asks, she's interested, I think, she asked about vulnerability and she asked about vulnerable areas that need urgent intervention, but maybe direct this towards Mimi because Mimi was discussing vulnerability, I thought, in ways that could perhaps engage interestingly with this question raised by Leonora, who focuses on, I think, geographically on regions that might need urgent intervention. But perhaps to address Leonora with perhaps expanding a little bit on the idea of vulnerability and how we understand vulnerability. We have Alessandra D has come in with a couple of points, which I think are linked. I'll put them together. And perhaps I think, again, this might be an issue for Ingrid. Perhaps FM Chan might want to talk about it, but it's the EU position on the protection of migrants affected by climate change. What is the EU position? And specifically for FM Chan, Alessandra D asks about the regularization that recently occurred in Italy, which obviously was particularly directed at workers in, well, a lot of workers in agriculture. So I think those are, maybe if we take those questions to start with, but please, if you have, I mean, more questions are coming in. Perhaps I just want one question, which I think could maybe for Carol. which has come from Sarah M, who asks if mobilities are influenced by a variety of political, economic, and social conditions. To what extent can immobility or mobilities be considered voluntary? So we've got some great questions already. I'll go back to the speakers in the order in which we heard from them. So perhaps start with you, Ingrid.
Thanks. So on relocation, so what I've seen in Bangladesh is that the government itself has not been doing so much in this regard. So often with sort of fast onset events like cyclones or something, then a lot of support is given. A lot of NGOs come, but there's also some governmental support, for instance, for distribution of rice or things like that. But especially with these more gradual, slow onset changes, which erosion is also, but that's sort of a natural phenomenon in the delta, but sea level rise is also in a way. There you don't really see, because it's all so slowly, so it's sort of taking place under the radar, so you don't really see much support other than people, communities and migrants helping each other. What I did see is that there's a local NGO, it's called IPSHA, a Young Power for Social Action, who I worked with. They connect with another international NGO on displacement solutions, who produced principles for the protection of displaced persons within, climate displaced persons within states, because most affected are still often usually relatively close to home. They use these principles, this NGO, IPSHA, already in some cases in Qutb Dia, which is an island in the southeast of Bangladesh, where they are doing research which houses are most at risk at the moment, and also asking who wants to move, who wants to stay, and also are connecting with hosting communities on the mainland, which is a more hillier part, so safer from the water in that sense, where they could go to. So it's really a sort of case by case, very small scale. And I've also seen in another area where the government via an international organization got funding to make new houses for those who lost it. But then those houses were given to those who voted for the local chairman. So it was quite corrupt in that sense, who got the housing and who didn't. Sorry. And who didn't. So that's still a problem quite often in Bangladesh, I think. Also related with embankments, which areas are protected and which are not. It's often also quite related to whether someone in the parliament also comes from the area or not. So that's a big problem there. Reflecting on that, maybe Mimi can say something about that, because I think she made the point that those who are polluting the most should then receive most of those displaced in their country. What you often see is that people don't necessarily want to go to another country or want to stay in their country, or so what are then, from a mobility justice perspectives, maybe solutions from that side, maybe indeed financial support being given so that resettlements or relocations can take place closer to where people are from. So it was just a question that popped up. On the other thing, on the petition, I actually don't exactly know much about that. There was the EU petition someone asked about.
Sorry, that it was. Well, so maybe we can just move on with the questions. I'll come back to that because I'm having to scroll along. But yeah. if we move on to FM chat, and if I relocate it, I will let you know.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think there are 2 points here, maybe kind of following up from the EU position on climate migration, climate mobilities. I'm not really sure if there is one. I'm not really on the top of the agenda, but I think EU has some other problems with migration itself before climate mobilities, climate migration could even be responded progressively. So I'm kind of dubious whether there is a position on this. Definitely there's a lot of talk and a lot of investment also in research, which was also something that we kind of criticized in our piece on nature climate change in terms of how particular research programs are designed and kind of branded in a more securitizing fashion. So I would just leave that one over there. But I think it's important to think that when we talk about climate mobilities, we cannot escape. So going back to the issue about regularization of the undocumented migrants in Italy and in Portugal, I think we should consider also the case of Syrian workers, Syrian refugees who turned workers in saving the agricultural production in different parts of the Mediterranean today. So most of those are not even regularized as those in Italy and in Portugal, which is in itself a temporary measure to save the crops. If I should rephrase the name of the book of Tim Mitchell, which referred to Bracero program in the US, in which the Mexican workers actually saved the crops for the US market. And I think today it's important that we look at the undocumented migrants, and at times of crisis, we kind of hold on to them to save us. So this shows us how the immoral and corrupt the whole framing of this debate is being done. So I think it's important that when we look at this regularization issue, there should be popular and political pressure to make sure that this is not only for a season to save the crops, but this is to make sure that these undocumented migrants and workers get a fair treatment in wherever they are.
Thank you. If we go now to Carol.
Yes, so the question was, can immobility ever be considered voluntary? Is that right?
Yeah, mobility and immobility is a kind of voluntary. Yes, I think that was the question.
Yes, I mean, I think it can. It's, you know, it goes to the question of agency of people, at risk. You know, they often have a very strong attachment to the place that they live in. In particular, Indigenous people have, thousands of years of connection to a particular place. Their ancestors are there. Their history is there. They, have very strong spiritual connections to these places. So when they very strongly articulate that they don't want to go, I guess it's a political position on not wanting to lose that connection to that place. So that's kind of what I mean by voluntary immobility. It's a particular expression of what, that particular vulnerable population's future is in their eyes. So it doesn't necessarily mean that mobility solutions are not warranted for that population. Things could change in the future. There are cases where, it's the different parts of the population might have different opinions on whether mobility solutions are warranted. So some might be advocating for more migration or relocation solutions while others want to stay in place. So it's not a hard and fast thing, and it's something that we need. But I do think it is a valid political position for some of these populations, particularly the Indigenous ones.
Thank you, Carol. So over to Mimi now.
Yeah, thanks. And I just want to sort of echo this discussion about, re-emplacement. That I love that concept that Carol's put forward. And when I think about vulnerability and what I call the principles of mobility justice, it's not, part of it is that those in the global north and those most responsible for climate debt should accept migrants, including the undocumented migrants who are already here, kind of keeping our food systems and agricultural systems going. But also there's key legal arguments that were put forward on behalf of Vanuatu by Margareta Viverinka Singh and Diana Hingasalili, which concern how within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, there's something called the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage. And their submission from Vanuatu to it's called WIM, points out what could be covered by compensation for climate loss and damage. And it includes the following: costs of relocation due to sea level rise for coastal communities, but also costs for climate resilient reconstruction after extreme weather events. Also social and gender protection measures, livelihood safety net programs for the most vulnerable, livelihood transformation programs, pro-poor microinsurance, crop insurance, and or insurance premium subsidies, contingency funds for local level emergency planning and local planning and comprehensive risk management, all sorts of capacity and institution building, technology cooperation and transfer. So there's many, many different tools that would help people stay in place or re-in place within their home communities of origin. That's all different kinds of measures that could come into view once we accept the notion that we owe climate debt, and that it would help with not just the management of migration, but all of these other ways to help people be less vulnerable.
Thank you, Mimi. So I've got some questions come in, and Ingrid also wanted to put a question to FM Chan, but maybe first up there's maybe start with you, Ingrid, because I need to scroll down my YouTube chat box to see where they are. So start with you.
First, very briefly, want to say something on the EU position. So indeed, like FM Chan was saying, the focus is often on ensuring that people don't come to the EU. So better prevention of displacement, prevention of migration, in that way through adaptation or other ways. In a way that's good, of course. If you hear also the stories from Carol and what Mimi was just saying, that people also want to stay often in place, but you also have many communities for whom mobility is key, like pastoralist communities. And also there's also this right to move. So there's not a lot of attention going to that from that perspective. And I want to ask to FM Chan, because you say that when you started that you didn't that you also looked into how adaptation planning or specific adaptation programs are affecting seasonal migrants. Do you have a specific example of that it's already happening in a negative or positive way? So how climate adaptation programs at the moment are impacting on them? Or maybe you said it, but maybe I missed it in the...
No.
Thank you. Could I just, there's another couple of questions which could I just pose to the panelists. We have a question which is from Estelle Martin Pascual, who's asked a number of questions, but perhaps with this one I could address to Carol. And Estelle asks about the Human Rights Committee decision relating to Mr. Uwane Tetiota, which I think is in relation to Kiribati and New Zealand, but really question, Estelle's asking about how you would value that decision. We have a question from Hugo MM, who asks about, and it maybe expands on the discussion of the European Union, but also more generally, asks about the development of humanitarian visas for environmentally displaced persons as a possible solution. And Hugo puts this as a solution at EU level, but I think humanitarian visas for the environmentally displaced might be an issue other members of the panel might want to address as well. So if we start with FM Chan, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'll be very quick. Well, thanks Ingrid for this. I think this is very important, and I didn't really go in depth in my talk on this, but I mean, most of my observations and arguments come from my own fieldwork in southern Turkey, where I spent some time with the seasonal worker communities. And this region happened to be the pilot region for climate change adaptation in Turkey as well. So some of the first climate change adaptation projects were implemented there, both soft and hard adaptation, as we would call it. And what I have observed over years in looking how particular adaptation interventions, such as insurance schemes and crop shifting and this and that have done, it basically decreased the bargaining power of seasonal workers over there vis-a-vis landowners, because landowners managed to somewhat have a buffer for their loss due to climatic extremes. But the seasonal workers basically were left out of the debate. I mean, they were completely sidelined, other than some extremely superficial interventions, which actually made things worse. And that's why when I was referring to maladaptation or adaptation going wrong, I think this is a big risk for these migrant communities, because if you do not take their own subjectivities, their own human experience in mobility into and put it as a factor in climate change adaptation decision making, the chances are that you will most likely fail. So I think it's really important that we need better information, better knowledge, better integration across the Mediterranean and elsewhere in terms of how human experience of seasonal mobilities play hand in hand with climate change and climate change adaptation.
Carol, would you like to respond to the questions that were put to you?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that Tiotia case, which was a Kiribati person in New Zealand who took a case of environmental migration or climate migration to the very highest levels of international law. And it was decided that although their particular case was not a case of climate refugeeism, I guess. Sorry, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to get the terms exactly right. But the point was that it seemed to set a precedent for if governments were failing to look after their citizens and there was a direct threat to life, I think, then there would be a case for the crossing of an international border for these people under international law, which is really significant and really important. And I've got absolutely really happy that these kind of decisions are being made. But you also have to take into account the context of Kiribati, where I guess, so it was many places in the Pacific, sort of, despite limited resources, despite limited human populations, human capacity to actually get things done in terms of adaptation, really driving forward at a global level the policies on climate mobility. There's huge developments in that area. Vanuatu, just to follow up on Mimi's example of Vanuatu, has recently implemented a extremely comprehensive climate displacement and mobilities national policy that integrates this issue across all sectors of Vanuatu and government areas from housing to social protection and everything in between. So it's an area where the governments are very concerned about climate mobility. They're doing a lot. Kiribati itself, even quite a long time ago now, had a president called Anote Tong who pioneered the concept of migration with dignity, which has since been repealed as a formal policy in Kiribati, but is still a concept that many of us climate mobility scholars are sort of still take very seriously as something that's important to think about. So, and just from knowing how the Pacific works, it's one of those areas where the government does seek to really look after its people, and the people don't like to criticise the government. So this case sort of makes that element of Pacific life not very clear. The Kiribati government is doing a lot in terms of adaptation, in terms of looking after its citizens. So it would take a lot a lot more disregard for the life and sort of livelihoods of its citizens for that case to actually have an effect in Kiribati, I think. So it's very much a theoretical kind of proposition at this point, because people's lives are not directly at stake from climate change, partly because the government is doing a lot in terms of adaptation. And this is the case, I think, throughout the Pacific. It may not be the case elsewhere.
Thank you, Carol. Before just going to Mimi, there's just another couple of points that have come in that she may want to address, or others. So I'll put them to the panel. If Mimi wants to pick up these points as well, or others do, then feel free. We have a question from, or an observation, I think, or comment from Samuel Umwangi, who asks whether, he's asked, when can we term migration mobility as a form of resilience or a lack of resilience? So Samuel Umwangi asked that. And then Federica Peloso asks, have any of the presenters encountered any significant gender discrepancies during their research? And Federica is interested in how gender affects or is affected by climate mobility. So I'll put those in, and Mimi has some issues that she may want to address, may want to pick up on some of those points as well. So hand over to you, Mimi.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, so many great questions being raised. And I just want to come back to the idea of, states that are protecting their citizens. And those might be like small island Pacific states or Caribbean states, but then it leaves open the question of what about all the people who are non-citizens, which so many people now are either undocumented or are stateless, children born stateless in many parts of the world, who are in some ways in the most vulnerable situations vis-a-vis climate displacement. And so I'm concerned that if we, on the one hand, I'm calling for certain kinds of like legal and state obligations vis-a-vis each other, but on the other hand, there's still a whole body of people who are not going to be protected because they're not citizens. So how do we address that? And someone raised the idea of humanitarian visas, and I think that's interesting, but it's such a slim straw to sort of build your hope on, where in the US we have what we call temporary protected status that was given, for example, to Haitians after the 2010 earthquake, but then it can be taken away again. And so you have this sense of sort of give and take under different political conditions. And I would think humanitarian visas might fall under that same kind of instability. And the other point I just want to make about, sort of is mobility resilience or lack of resilience is it comes back to this point about agency, both the agency of individuals and of collectives, and the way in which mobilities, there's so many informal mobilities and commoning of mobilities. The caravans that helped protect people who were moving from Central America across Mexico. The informal mobilities within cities of street vendors and people, getting around and making a livelihood. What Haitians call chercher la vie is so important as a form of survival under current conditions. And it is a kind of resilience, and it's also, it's unstoppable, right? People will keep moving, and I think we just need to remember that.
Thank you very much, Mimi. So I think we're running a little bit out of time, but I know that Ingrid, that maybe go to the other panelists in case any final comments, observations they wanted to make. Start with you, Ingrid.
Yeah, sure. I'll give my reflections on the last two questions that were here as my final input. So I think indeed the point is that both mobility show both sides of vulnerability, but also of agency. You see both happening, also both at the same time. For instance, in Bangladesh, I met, and this is also about gender. because very often, of course, we hear, and it's also true, that the women are somewhat less options to move when the men often go elsewhere, for instance, for seasonal labor. But it doesn't necessarily that could increase the vulnerability of women, but it doesn't necessarily make passive victims either. Like for instance, in Bangladesh, I've seen an area where a lot of men had left because they were away for labor migration, etc., to cities, that the women really took ownership of what was happening to their area, because it was increasingly flooded, and they were asking around and looking around for other houses in other areas. So one of these women, I met her now a few times, so I'm sort of tracing her story in the long term. She's now together with some other neighbors, and of course their husbands were also involved in that. They bought a second sort of home in another area, which is sort of their emergency home where they come in times when the water is too high. So of course there's a clear side of gender and vulnerability there, but you also see clear cases where women also take agency, precisely because the men are away. And in women, and in Bangladesh, which is quite male dominated, it sort of gave actually women somewhat more flexibility to move and to make decisions, which indeed shows, and again, on one hand, their resilience and vulnerability sort of at the same time. Also, in this debate, also sometimes it has been said that migration is also a way for adaptation, a way to become more resilient, to sort of diversify skill sets. That perception, as the others have been critiquing that, then most of the responsibilities put at the migrants, and sort of muting notions of climate or mobility justice, as Mimi was talking about. So that's a bigger debate that's going on and still ongoing. I guess I leave it there.
Thank you, Ingrid. Carol, did you have anything you wanted to add? No? And FM Chan, anything you wanted to add?
Maybe just one line. I think it's really important to focus on the question of gender. I mean, I think that's a great point, because women are definitely on the front lines of disaster recovery as well. And that's important because most of the time we tend to kind of put things into different boxes, and the unpaid labor of women in social reproduction also applies in the case of disaster recovery, which is a key issue in climate change adaptation. But as a last comment, maybe I should say that how I see climate mobilities is more of an open, honest question rather than a pre-cooked answer to the problems that we face today. I think this is an invitation for further discussion. I, for one, do not have clear answers to many of the questions raised, but I think this is a good opportunity to talk further about climate mobilities.
Thank you so much. Mimi, was there anything you wanted to add before we conclude?
Oh, well, I feel like we're out of time, but I'll just say one thing as terms of displacement. I would argue that those of us who are comfortable and secure in our lives may need to think about displacing some of our comfort in order to fix what we've caused in the world.
Thanks, Mimi, and thanks to all panelists, and also to the people who've joined us today. It's been a really fantastic discussion with some really powerful insight, and also I think an invitation for an ongoing discussion about these really important questions. I think we've started to open up today some hugely important questions which have massive implications, I think, as Mimi was saying, and as other presentations have showed, way beyond the discussion of migration and mobility to how we live our lives, our responsibilities, and have a really quite profound understanding, I think, of migration and mobility, the agency of migrants and those who are mobile. So I think it's been a really, really important discussion. We're very grateful to the panelists for taking the time. And I think particularly to Carol in Australia, we're extremely grateful you've been able to stay up so late to share your insights with us. So thanks so much for doing that. And we know also it's a bit earlier in the morning for Mimi in the US. So we're very grateful, and also to, as I say, to everybody who's asked questions, everybody who's joined us. Could I just also point out for those who are interested that we do have more seminars coming up. So next week we're having on the 3 p.m. Central European time. We've got a webinar on refugees and migration in the Middle East and North Africa. And the week after that, we've got a webinar which is on Brexit and the role that migration played in Brexit. So quite diverse topics, quite different from what we've been discussing this afternoon. But anyway, thanks very much for joining us. And we hope that you will be able to engage with our work and also the work of our panelists. Thank you.
Thank you.